She pointed at him across the conference table, 12 executives watching. You. Her voice dropped just low enough to make it deliberate. The man who mops my floors thinks he can solve what my MIT engineers couldn't. Marcus didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there holding his maintenance clipboard while Sandra Price smiled the kind of smile that wasn't a smile at all. Fine. She spread her hands wide, like she was offering a gift. 60 minutes. Fix a $2 million engine that's been broken for 6 weeks. In front of everyone, a pause letting it land. When you fail and you will, security walks you out permanently. The room waited for him to flinch. He didn't. He set the clipboard down, slowly, walked toward the engine. And what nobody in that room knew what Sandra Price was about to find out, the hard way, was that Marcus Elliott had already solved it. 11 days ago, he'd just been waiting for someone to finally ask. Have you ever walked into a room full of people and felt completely invisible? Not because you were shy, not because you didn't belong, but because they'd already decided before you opened your mouth, before you took a single step, that you didn't matter. That the ceiling on what you could know, what you could contribute, what you could be, had already been measured and marked and was lower than the door you just walked through. Marcus Elliott knew that feeling the way some men knew the back of their own hands. He'd been knowing it for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. The 11 days part was new. The 3 years and 2 months was just the weather. The mop moved in slow arcs across the marble floor of the 14th floor hallway at Velocity Drive Technologies, catching the reflection of the overhead fluorescence in long liquid strips. Marcus pushed the handle with one hand, the other tucked in the front pocket of his navy polo. The fabric had been washed so many times the company logo over his chest had faded to a pale suggestion of itself. Still there, still recognizable, but requiring more attention than most people bothered to give it. He had stopped thinking about that a long time ago. There were more important things to track. The building smelled like money in the morning. That specific Atlanta money smell, cold air conditioning, cranked 3 degrees below comfort. Expensive cologne from men who arrived at 7 to signal importance. And somewhere underneath all of it, the faint chemical scent of ambition that never quite aired out, no matter how many windows the HVAC system cycled through. Velocity Drive Technologies occupied floors 9 through 16 of a glass tower on Peachtree Center Avenue. 1,200 employees across 8 floors. Autonomous vehicle technology. The kind of company that got profiled in magazines and podcasted about in circles far beyond Georgia, which always struck Marcus as slightly ironic, since the most interesting engineering problem in the building had been sitting unsolved for 6 weeks, while everyone looked in every direction except the one that mattered. He had learned the rhythms of this place the way you learn a neighborhood, not from a map, but from years of walking the same routes at the same hours, until the environment stopped being a location and started being a language. He knew that the engineers on 14 arrived between 8:45 and 9:15, coffee already in hand, and that they left the conference room lights on after every meeting because nobody had been designated responsible for turning them off. And that absence of designation had calcified into assumption. He knew that the printer on the east wall jammed every Tuesday because the paper tray ran low over the weekend and nobody restocked it until the complaining reached a sufficient volume. He knew that Sandra Price's executive assistant, Kimberly, always left a stack of technical documents on the main conference table after Friday afternoon meetings because she was exhausted by then, and planned to file them Monday morning and never did because by Monday there were new documents requiring attention and the old ones migrated toward the edges of the table and eventually got stacked near the window. Those documents, those carelessly abandoned, beautifully precise documents. Marcus had been reading them for 37 months, not on purpose, not at first. The first time, he had just been wiping down the table, and a header had caught his eye, harmonic frequency analysis in AI-assisted powertrain systems, and his hand had stopped moving before his brain gave it permission. He had stood there for almost a full minute reading. Then he had set the cloth down, stood back, and read the entire first page. He had gone home that night and pulled up 3 engineering journals on his phone. That had been the beginning of something he did not have a name for yet, and had not tried to name, because naming it would have required a conversation with himself about what it meant that the most intellectually nourishing part of his workday was reading documents he was not supposed to have opinions about. The elevator opened at the end of the hallway and Brian Okafor stepped out with his laptop bag over one shoulder and a look on his face that Marcus had never seen on him before. Not stressed, Brian was always some version of stressed. That was the baseline condition of a man running a 12-person engineering team 6 weeks into a crisis with no resolution on the horizon. This was different from stress. This was the particular expression of a man who had realized something and could not unrealize it, and was now navigating the space between the realization and the decision about what to do with it. Brian walked past Marcus without looking down. Normal. What was not normal was that 3 steps past, he stopped, stood for a moment, then kept walking without turning around. Marcus filed that. Something was different about Brian Okafor this morning. He didn't know what yet. He finished the hallway and moved on, and let the observations sit in the part of his mind reserved for things worth returning to. The thing about being invisible was this. You saw everything, every mistake, every half-formed decision, every conversation that people had in lowered voices 2 feet away from you, because the context of your presence, the uniform, the equipment, the assumed ceiling on your comprehension made you functionally furniture. Marcus had overheard quarterly projection arguments between executives who would have gone to separate floors rather than have that conversation in front of a colleague. He had stood at the back of rooms and listened to engineers talk through theories about the broken engine while he replaced the water pitcher. And he had heard every wrong turn they took, every assumption that steered them further from what was actually wrong, every confident dead end that cost another day. He had known what the problem probably was for 11 days. 11 days. He turned that number over sometimes, when he was lying awake at 2 in the morning in his apartment on Campbellton Road. The window unit doing its uneven hum, his yellow legal pad open on the desk. With calculations he had run 3 times to be sure. 11 days of knowing, or near enough to knowing that the remaining distance was just confirmation, not discovery, and saying nothing. Because what did that look like, exactly? He ran the scenario the way you run your tongue over a sore tooth, not because it helps, but because you cannot stop. Marcus Elliott, technical facilities consultant, which was the administrative poetry for janitor, walks into the main conference room where a 12-person engineering team from Georgia Tech and Howard and Morehouse is spending its 16th consecutive week in a crisis. And he says what, precisely? He says he has been reading the documents off the table while he cleans. He says he has a theory. He says he worked it out on a legal pad in his car, right? So he had said nothing for 11 days and kept running the math to make sure it was still right. His phone rang at 8:47, just as he was moving the cart to the janitorial closet near the stairwell. The contact photo showed his mother at her kitchen table, the one taken last Thanksgiving before any of this year had happened, when she had been wearing the green sweater and laughing at something off camera. Denise Elliott's voice had a barometric quality that Marcus had learned to read before she said a single informational word. Today it was tired but warm, which meant she had slept reasonably, and the nausea from Tuesday's session had passed into the background where it lived between treatments. That was the best version of her mornings right now. You eat breakfast? I had something, Marcus. A granola bar. And coffee. A granola bar is not breakfast. It has oats. The sound she made in response communicated several things simultaneously: exasperation, affection, the particular parental frequency that exists in no dictionary, but every adult child recognizes with the full clarity of their nervous system. He smiled at the wall of the janitorial closet. How are you feeling? He asked. Good. Better than Wednesday. Dr. Patterson says the numbers from last week are moving in the right direction. A pause. The specific pause of someone who has learned to let medical news settle before she speaks it, so that the speaking becomes steady rather than raw. She didn't want to overstate it, but she said moving in the right direction. He absorbed that. Numbers moving in the right direction, not resolved, not finished, but directional, which after 6 rounds of chemotherapy at Grady Memorial was something you learned to receive with the full weight of fragile gratitude it deserved. That's good, Mama. Don't change the subject. I know you're working. I'm not keeping you. I just wanted to hear your voice. She paused. You sound tired. I'm fine. Marcus Elliott, Mama. When you use that particular tone of fine, you sound exactly like your grandfather, which, in this context, is not a compliment. He laughed, a real one. brief and sudden, the kind that comes before the filter can catch it. In the hallway outside the closet, someone walked past with a cart of presentation equipment, too focused on a deadline to notice the sound from the slightly open door. "I'll eat a real lunch," he said. "You better. I love you too." He held the phone for a moment after she disconnected, stood in the closet that smelled of floor wax and cleaning concentrate, and did what his grandfather had done in the garage every morning. Before opening the door, took 60 seconds to remember what all of it was for, before the day started asserting its own priorities. His mother's voice when she said, moving in the right direction. The specific warmth of tired but warm on a Thursday morning. The green sweater in the photograph. He pocketed the phone, unlocked the cart, and went back into the hallway. The morning moved in its usual patterns. Marcus moved through the floor, doing the work that was assigned to him, the water pitcher in the East conference room, the paper jam on the printer that had been jamming every Tuesday for 14 months, because nobody had escalated the paper storage situation, to someone with the authority to order a larger tray, the burned-out bulb in the hallway near the engineering team's primary workspace that had been on the work order for 3 days. While he worked, he listened, not deliberately. Just because 3 years of working in a building had tuned his attention to its frequencies the way long habitation tunes you to the particular sounds of a house, which creak means the furnace, which rattle means the window that needs recaulking, which silence means something has changed. What he heard from the engineering floor that morning was the particular quality of people who have been failing at the same thing for too long and are beginning to understand what that might cost. Not panic, more like the low-grade hypervigilance of a system running at sustained capacity, where every small thing carries more weight than it should, because there is no margin left to absorb it. He heard Sandra's assistant Kimberly mention Jerome King's name to a colleague in a whispered register that people use when a name has become weighted with consequence. He heard 2 engineers in the kitchen area have a conversation that started as strategy and shifted into the specific exhaustion of people who have run out of new ideas and are too tired to pretend otherwise. He replaced the water pitcher in the East conference room, and on the table, visible from where he stood, was the latest diagnostic report, the 67th test, printed and annotated with the same error code that had been appearing since the beginning. Harmonic disruption detected. Thermal protection engaged. Engine shutdown initiated the same error, the same interval, the same 14 minutes and 23 seconds every single time. Marcus looked at the report for the 7 seconds it took to cross the room and set the water pitcher in its place. He did not need more than 7 seconds. The report confirmed what his calculations had been telling him for 11 days. He had not been wrong. He picked up the empty pitcher and left the conference room. The 4th floor cafeteria at 12:31 had the particular energy of a room past its main rush, settled into the quieter demographic of deliberate avoiders of communal timing, people with complex sandwiches and notebooks, and the occasional executive who needed to think somewhere that wasn't behind a glass wall. Marcus sat in the corner with his back against the wall, which was habit rather than strategy, although the two had blurred over time, with a sandwich he had made that morning, and his phone open to the most recent SAE Journal article he had downloaded the previous night using a library card that his former professor, Dr. Rena Patterson from Georgia Perimeter, had told him to keep after his last class and never asked to have returned. The article was on diagnostic methodology in AI mechanical interface systems. He had read it twice. He was on his 3rd reading because one paragraph on page 14 kept pulling at something, the specific cognitive hook of a piece of information that is not quite landing in its correct place, that needs to sit next to something else before it resolves. He was working on what that something else was. He heard the chair across from him scrape against the linoleum. Brian Okafor sat down. Marcus looked up, looked at Brian, looked back down, then looked up again, because the instinct toward invisibility was 3 years deep. But what Brian had just done, cross a room and sit down directly across from him without hesitation, without the glancing social negotiation that usually preceded any interaction between people from different floors of this hierarchy, registered as something that required attention. They looked at each other for a moment. Brian Okafor, direct. No performance of casualness. I know who you are. Something moved briefly in Brian's expression, not quite surprise. More like the recognition of someone who has just confirmed a hypothesis. Marcus, right? Maintenance. Technical facilities consultant. Not defensive. Just accurate. The distinction had stopped being about ego a long time ago and had become about precision, which was the only register Marcus bothered with for facts. Brian absorbed the correction without comment, which was more than most people managed. He looked at the phone on the table, at the density of text visible on the screen, the kind of dense technical writing that people don't encounter accidentally. What are you reading? Diagnostic methodology. AI mechanical interface systems. Society of Automotive Engineers. Brian's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. The cup came back down. He leaned forward, slightly just enough to change the conversation from passing to deliberate. Where did you study? Georgia Perimeter. Mechanical engineering. When did you graduate? 6 years ago. The math happening in Brian's face was visible if you knew what to look for. Marcus knew what to look for. Brian was doing the calculation between what he had assumed about the person who replaced the water pitchers on his floor and what he was currently looking at, and finding that the gap between those two things was larger than he had thought and had real implications. You've been here 3 years, Brian said. 3 years and 2 months. Brian looked at his coffee. Then back at Marcus. Then the engine problem. You've heard about it. It's hard not to. What have you heard? Enough. Marcus set the phone face down on the table. Not performing calm, actually calm, because the situation called for precision, not performance. It starts. Runs for approximately 14 minutes, shuts down. Same error every time. 1423, Brian said. Exactly. 67 tests. Marcus nodded once. 1423 isn't a random interval. Brian went completely still. Random failures have random timing. Precise failure intervals mean something specific is happening at that interval. Something that accumulates. Something predictable. Marcus looked at his phone, then back at Brian. The engine was assembled where? Memphis. Core components from a contractor in Ohio. Ohio uses SAE standards. Imperial measurements. Correct. The AI calibration software developed here? In-house. Yes. Metric? The stillness in Brian's face had changed quality. We converted from imperial to metric when we wrote the calibration code. Standard practice for international compatibility. Who performed the conversion? The pause that followed had a shape to it. A geometry that Marcus recognized as the shape of an answer someone is not yet sure they want to give. I'd need to check the code history to be specific. Marcus picked up his phone, turned it back over. Read the paragraph on page 14, the one that had been pulling at him through 3 readings one more time. Not because he needed to. Because he needed 3 more seconds before he said what came next. And reading was the cleanest way to take them. If the conversion has even a small error, if someone used 25.3 millimeters per inch instead of 25.4, the calibration points accumulate drift. Not immediately, gradually. Over time, with 47 calibration points, each carrying that fractional error, the accumulated drift reaches a threshold that the engine management system reads as a thermal event. He set the phone down. And then it shuts down, exactly as designed. Protecting itself from a problem that doesn't exist, Brian did not move. That's why the interval is precise, Marcus continued. It's not a malfunction. It's the system working correctly with incorrect inputs. The math runs out at the same place every time. The cafeteria moved around them, trays sliding. A cluster of marketing people walking past with the distracted energy of a team heading toward a deadline, a burst of laughter from somewhere near the windows. None of it reached this table. How long have you been thinking about this? Brian's voice was careful, the voice of a man who is receiving information that has consequences and is tracking those consequences in real time. 11 days, Marcus said, give or take. Brian looked at him for a long moment. He started to ask the obvious question, the one that began with, why didn't you, and then stopped himself, before the end of it. Because he was smart enough to know how it finished, and smart enough to know that he did not have the standing to ask it. Not him, not in this building, not after 3 years of passing the man in the hallway without stopping. Tonight, Brian said finally. His voice had changed. Something in it had settled into a decision. 9 o'clock. Engine room on 14. I'll be running the last diagnostic of the day. The floor clears out by 8:30. He stood up, picked up his coffee. If you happen to be on that floor, he walked away without looking back. Marcus looked at the sandwich. At the door Brian had just walked through. At the phone with the article still open on page 14, he thought about 11 days, about the calculations on the legal pad, about the math that was correct the first time and the second time and the third time he ran it, and was presumably still correct right now, 9 o'clock. He finished his lunch the way he finished every lunch alone, in the corner, with his back against the wall. But the quality of the aloneness was different, charged. The specific quality of a thing that is about to change. Donna Price showed up at Sandra's apartment at 8 that evening with a bottle of Malbec and a box of Sublime donuts from the Midtown location. She had a key. Had always had a key. Used it the way younger sisters use borrowed keys, not as intrusion but as the operating assumption that the distinction between your space and mine collapses when it matters. Sandra was at the kitchen island with her laptop open and a glass of water that had been there long enough to be room temperature. She looked up when the door opened and did the specific unwinding that only happened around Donna not relaxing, exactly, but the particular release of a person who can stop performing competence for a few hours because the audience has left. I heard the demo failed again this morning, Donna said. Not an accusation. Just the entry point, the way Donna always entered difficult conversations. Through the fact. Because the fact was already in the room and pretending otherwise cost more than acknowledging it. Where did you hear that? Your VP of marketing is connected to someone I know. Donna opened the wine, poured 2 glasses, slid one across the island. Also, you have the look. I don't have a look, Sandra. Patient. You have a look. You've had this look since Mrs. Hendricks told you your science project was second best in the 4th grade. You get very still and your blink rate slows down. Sandra looked at her sister. My blink rate. You're doing it right now. Donna opened the donut box, passed the creme brulee one to Sandra with the particular authority of someone who knows what her person needs before being asked. Sandra took it, looked at it, looked at Donna. Jerome King lands Thursday at 2. I know. If the engine isn't running by then, I know what it means, Sandra. I read the news, I understand the cascade. Donna ate a bite. Waited. The specific patience of a person who knows when the real conversation is about to start. But I'm not asking about Jerome King. I'm asking what you're doing. I have 12 engineers, your engineering team. Yes. Are those the only people in the building you have? Sandra looked at her. I'm not suggesting anything specific, Donna said. Her hands were open on the counter. A gesture of non-implication. I'm asking if you've looked everywhere. Or if you've looked at the people you already decided were the right places to look. The sentence landed somewhere specific in Sandra's thinking, not as an answer, but as a shape. Something with edges she couldn't quite trace yet. She turned it over without being able to find the front of it. The conversation moved on to Donna's architectural project in Buckhead, their mother's birthday in November. Whether Sandra had eaten anything today that wasn't caffeine and determination. The engine crisis retreated to the periphery, the way large problems do when smaller human things fill the foreground, which was always what Donna was doing when she appeared with wine and donuts on a crisis evening. She was not ignoring the problem. She was feeding the person who had to solve it. After Donna left, Sandra stood at the window alone. Atlanta at 10 o'clock. The highways lit in both directions, the building lights making the horizon glow that specific orange that cities make when they breathe at night. She had built 3 companies in this city. She understood resources and how to find them. She knew how to read a room, map a problem, identify what was missing from the available inventory of solutions. She was missing something. She could feel its absence the way you feel a word at the edge of recall present, certain, one turn away from landing. She went to bed without finding it. But the shape of Donna's question, are those the only people you have stayed somewhere in her thinking? Below the level of sleep. The engine room at 9:15 at night had a different register from any other hour. The diagnostic equipment ran at a lower hum without the overlay of voices and foot traffic. The overhead lights ran on a motion sensor and clicked on in full fluorescent when Marcus came through with his cart, flooding the space in that particular clinical white that made everything look slightly underwater. Brian was already there, arms crossed, leaning against the far wall with the stillness of a man who had arrived early enough to have thoughts he was still sorting through. They didn't open with small talk. There was no version of this situation where small talk was the right instrument. Marcus set the cart against the wall, pulled the vibration analyzer from his maintenance bag, a Fluke 810 handheld unit from the equipment room on 12, signed out 3 days ago for a logged HVAC inspection, and crossed to the engine without further preamble. He stood in front of it, not looming, not assessing from a remove. Present, fully present, in the specific way his grandfather had been present with machines, without the layer of performance that most people added when they wanted to demonstrate that they were paying attention. Just the attention itself, directed at the object. He placed both hands flat on the housing, closed his eyes. Brian watched from the wall. Whatever he had expected from this moment, whatever version of it he had constructed during the hour, he spent deciding whether to extend this invitation. It was not this, not the absence of narration, not the quality of attention that didn't require an audience. It was strange to watch because it was entirely real, and entirely real things were increasingly hard to find in a building where most demonstrations of expertise came packaged with the performance of expertise. It's working against itself. Marcus's eyes were still closed. His hands had not moved. The vibration pattern there are two frequencies that are almost synchronized. Almost. The gap is small enough that standard diagnostic protocols filter it as ambient noise. But it's not ambient. It's structural. He opened his eyes, turned to the oscilloscope. Can you run a start sequence? Brian keyed the sequence. The engine turned over the familiar, deep, almost right rumble that all 67 tests had produced. That sound of power that kept not quite settling into the authority it was designed to have. Marcus moved the analyzer to 5 points on the housing, reading each one, writing on the legal pad with the shorthand of someone who has developed his own notation system over years of work that no one was supervising or reviewing. Numbers and small diagrams. Not frantic methodical, with the specific organization of a person who knows where each piece of information will need to sit relative to the others. There, he pointed to the oscilloscope display. A pattern in the waveform. That irregularity. It occurs every 47 cycles. You're not looking for the irregularity in the main signal. Standard diagnostic filters suppress it. You're looking for what the main signal does right before the compensation event. He traced the waveform with his pen, not touching the screen. The dip. Every 47 cycles, the main frequency dips by a fraction before the management system compensates. That dip is the engine trying to correct for something it's misreading as misalignment. Brian moved closer to the display. He had been looking at this data for 6 weeks. He looked at it differently now. The dip was there, had been there every test. Below the standard deviation flag, logged as ambient noise in every report. See it? Marcus asked. Brian was quiet for a moment. I see it. The engine isn't misaligned. The misalignment is a measurement artifact. The AI is reading incorrect numbers and correcting for a problem that exists only in the discrepancy between what the calibration assumes and what the components are actually doing. Marcus set the analyzer down. If someone entered 25.3 millimeters per inch instead of 25.4 in the conversion code. It's a rounding choice, Brian said. His voice had the specific tightness of a man locating the source of a very expensive problem. Some style guides suggest it for simplicity. For most applications, the difference is negligible. For most applications, Marcus looked at him. For 47 calibration points on an AI-integrated powertrain where the management system makes micro-corrections 50 times per second, the cumulative error. Brian was running it in his head. 47 points, each one carrying the delta, 50 corrections per second. The accumulated drift reaches the thermal threshold at 14 minutes and 22.8 seconds, Marcus said. Rounded to 23 in the system logs, the engine ran on. At 14 minutes and 23 seconds, the thermal protection initiated. The screens filled with the error code that had been filling screens for 6 weeks. The engine went quiet. The room was quiet too. Who wrote the conversion code? Marcus asked. Brian's jaw moved. An intern. Last August. He was excellent, graduated early from Spellman's computational track. Left when the contract ended in November. A pause. The code was reviewed by the software team lead, not a mechanical engineer. The assumption was that a metric to imperial conversion was a solved problem. Below the threshold for cross-disciplinary review, Marcus looked at the stilled engine, at the error code, at 6 weeks of misdirected effort that had led every expert in the building, away from 3 lines of code written by a 22-year-old making a reasonable assumption in August. The fix, he said, is a vibration dampener plate. Custom machined, installed at mounting bracket 3 between the sensor cluster and the crankshaft housing. It absorbs the frequency drift. The AI reads clean. The thermal protection stops triggering. Brian looked at him. How long to source the part? Supplier in Marietta. I can get them specs tonight. 6 to 8 hours to machine it. Brian did the arithmetic. Part ready by 8 in the morning. Installed by 10. Test data accumulating through the afternoon. Jerome King arriving at 2 tight. The kind of tight where one thing going wrong ends the entire sequence. But not zero. Cost, Brian asked. $80 to $90. Depending on alloy. Something crossed Brian's face then. Not amusement. Vertigo. The specific vertigo of standing at the edge of a fact that rearranges everything. 6 weeks, 12 engineers, 4 consulting firms, 67 tests, and finding that the fact is an $80 part and a maintenance worker's legal pad. He picked up his phone and stopped. He looked at Marcus, at the phone, back at Marcus. And Marcus could see it happening in real time, the fork in Brian's character, both directions real, both available, the easier one involving a logical argument that would be genuinely hard to disprove. Brian had been part of the confirmation. He understood the methodology. He could present this analysis credibly. Marcus had no access to the engineering system, no documentation trail, no record of his involvement that would survive a standard audit. Brian held that option for 30 seconds. Then he put the phone in his pocket. Tomorrow, he said. 2 o'clock. Conference room on 14. I need you in that room. I'm not on any meeting list for that room, I know. I'll handle it. He picked up his laptop bag. At the door he turned. Marcus, I don't know how you've been doing this for 3 years. It wasn't apology and it wasn't admiration exactly. It was somewhere between them, which was probably the most honest location for it. Marcus looked at him. You keep doing what you're doing it for, he said. That's the whole thing. You just keep doing it. Brian left. Marcus stood alone with the engine in the humming quiet of the building's overnight breath. He placed one hand on the housing flat, still, the way his grandfather had taught him. The vibration moved through his palm, the machine still fighting itself. Still looking for a rhythm it couldn't reach because something small and precise was standing between it and what it was designed to do. Not much longer, he thought. He picked up the mop, finished his shift, and in the parking garage at 10:52, sitting in the Civic with the legal pad open on his knee, he called Dr. Patterson's voicemail and left a message with the specifications he needed from the SAE database, which she had access to and had told him 4 years ago to use without asking. She checked messages before 8. She would have the data to him by 7. He drove home through the city's late-night frequencies, the highway lights sliding over the windshield, Atlanta making its ordinary overnight sounds, and let himself, for the first time in 11 days, feel something that was not calculation and not patience and not the careful management of expectation, but was instead the sharp, clean, forward-facing thing that his grandfather had called readiness. For tomorrow, he was ready. The text from Dr. Patterson arrived as a voice memo at 6:52 in the morning. Not a text. Rena Patterson had considered opinions about transmitting technical specifications via text message, and those opinions ran toward the spoken word, which could carry nuance that strings of numbers on a screen could not. Her voice had the quality of a woman who had been reading since 5 and was on her second coffee and had arrived at something that sat between concern and excitement without being fully either. Marcus, the recording started without preamble, which was her way. I pulled the A reference data you needed. The tolerance specifications for harmonic dampener plates in AI-integrated powertrains are tighter than standard automotive. Significantly tighter. You're going to need a machinist working in aerospace-adjacent precision, not general auto parts grade. The Marietta supplier called them before 7:30 and asked specifically for their ISO 9001 certified line. Tell them aerospace equivalent. Don't say automotive or they'll default to the wrong alloy. A pause. The sound of a mug being set on a hard surface. Also, Marcus, whatever you're doing with this, the math is correct. The application is correct. If someone tells you otherwise, they haven't run the calculation. A longer pause. You know you can call me. Not just for the library card. He played it twice in the parking lot of his apartment complex before going upstairs. Then he called the Marietta supplier at 7. 18 and asked for the ISO 9001 line. The man who answered was named Anthony, went by Tony, and had spent 11 years machining aerospace components before a contract ended and redirected him to a precision parts supplier in Cobb County. He knew exactly what Marcus was describing before Marcus finished describing it. He said he could have a finished plate by 9:30 if the drawings arrived by 8. Marcus had the drawings on his legal pad. He photographed each page under the kitchen light, 6 pages, each annotated with dimensions and tolerances, and the specific notation system he had developed over years of working alone, and sent them in a message. Tony confirmed receipt in 4 minutes. He asked one question about the alloy specification. Marcus answered it. Tony said he would call when the part was finished. $86 plus a rush machining fee that brought the total to $140. Marcus put the phone on the kitchen table and sat with that number for a moment. Not the dollar amount, the math of it. $140, 6 weeks, 12 engineers, 4 consulting firms, 67 tests, 1 intern's August assumption about a rounding convention. He showered, made actual eggs with toast, because his mother would ask, and he intended to be able to answer honestly. Put on a fresh uniform, and drove toward Peachtree Center in the early Atlanta morning, the highway still finding its pace, the city in the specific state of becoming itself that existed for about 40 minutes before the full weight of the day arrived. He did not rehearse the 2 o'clock meeting. He had learned over years of carrying knowledge that no one had asked for of being correct in rooms that had not invited his correctness, that rehearsing the presentation of true things was a way of arriving at the moment already hollowed out. Instead, he thought about the dampener plate, about Tony's machining process running right now in a shop off South Cobb Drive, about the specific alloy grade and what its vibration absorption coefficient would do at each of the 47 calibration points. He thought about the engine the way his grandfather had taught him to think about any machine, before repairing it with respect for what it was built to be, before dealing with what it had become. By the time he pulled into the parking garage at Peachtree Center, he had settled into the particular calm of a person who has done the work, checked the work, and is now simply waiting for the moment when the work gets to speak. He clocked in at 8:03, took the elevator to 14, and began his assigned shift the way he had begun every shift for 3 years, invisibly, competently, and with complete attention. Brian Okafor had not slept. This was not new. The past 6 weeks had produced a cumulative sleep deficit that he had stopped trying to calculate because the number was demoralizing, but last night had a different texture. Previous sleepless nights had the quality of anxiety, of running a maze and finding only walls. Last night was something else. Last night he lay in the dark next to Stephanie and stared at the ceiling and felt the particular alertness of a man who has found the door in the maze and is standing in front of it and has not yet fully decided whether to open it. Stephanie knew. She had always known things about Brian before he articulated them, which was one of the approximately 37 reasons he had married her, and one of the occasionally uncomfortable features of a life shared with someone who paid full attention. At 3 in the morning, she reached over without opening her eyes and put her hand on his arm. "Tell me," she said. Still not opening her eyes, he told her everything: the cafeteria conversation, the engine room, the legal pad, the $86 part that had already been ordered from a machinist in Marietta. Stephanie was quiet for a long moment after he finished. Long enough that he thought she might have gone back to sleep. Then, "You're going to do the right thing. I don't know what that costs yet." "Yes, you do." Her hand didn't move from his arm. "That's exactly why you can't sleep." He drove in at 7:40. Sandra's car was already in the executive lot. He took the elevator to 14, walked past the engine room locked, waiting, holding the accumulated weight of 6 weeks of failure, and went to his desk and opened the code repository for the AI calibration system. It took him 4 minutes to find the conversion function. 3 lines. Written by a 22-year-old in August who had been excellent at his job and had made one assumption that seemed so obvious in context that it had not registered as an assumption at all. The assumption that 25.3 was close enough to 25.4 for this application. The way it was close enough for most applications. The way most people round most things, and the rounding disappears into acceptable margins. Except this application had 47 calibration points and an AI system making 50 micro-corrections per second, and the margins had not been acceptable. They had been catastrophic in the specific slow-motion way that small errors become catastrophic not dramatically, not all at once, but accumulating with mathematical patience until the threshold was reached and the system did exactly what it was designed to do with incorrect inputs. Brian sat back, looked at 3 lines of code, looked at 6 weeks of his team's work on the other side of those 3 lines. He opened a new email to Sandra, started typing, got 3 sentences in factual, neutral, the kind of sentences that report a finding without attributing it, and stopped, deleted it, picked up his phone and called Marcus. Supplier confirmed, no greeting from Marcus either. Just the relevant question, I'm calling you first. What's the status? Parts being machined. Ready by 9:30? Good. Brian pulled up the conference room calendar, looked at the 2 o'clock slot, added a name. I've listed you as engineering liaison in the system. It's the closest category that moves you past the building access flag without a guest process. A beat, engineering liaison, it gets you in the room. Okay, Marcus. Brian stopped, looked at the 3 deleted sentences still hovering in his memory. When we go in, I want you to present your own analysis, not me presenting it. You. The silence had weight, not hesitation. Something more considered. Sandra's going to have things to say about that. Probably. She doesn't know who I am. She's about to. Another pause. Then, I'll be there at 2. Brian hung up, and felt the specific sensation of having committed to a thing that cannot be uncommitted to, not dread, not second-guessing, but the clean and slightly vertiginous feeling of having drawn a line in his own character and stepped to the more expensive side of it. He called the Marietta supplier next, confirmed the order, put it on his personal card, then opened the engineering team's morning stand-up notes and spent the next 2 hours doing the work of his actual job while carrying the weight of what 2 o'clock was going to be. At 9:15, Stephanie texted, "How are you doing?" He typed back, "About to do something that might matter more than anything I've done in this job." She replied in under a minute. "Then do it right." He put the phone away, got back to work. At 9:47, Brian drove to Marietta himself. He could have sent someone. He had people whose job descriptions included exactly this kind of parts retrieval. He chose not to send them and did not examine that choice too carefully, only registered that it felt necessary in the way that some things feel necessary without being easily articulable. The shop was in an industrial park off South Cobb Drive, a low slung building with a loading dock and no signage beyond the street number and the company name in plain block letters. The kind of building that did serious work without advertising it. Tony met him at the side entrance, a compact man with machine oil permanently in the creases of his hands and the easy authority of someone who has been making precise things for a long time and no longer needs anyone's validation of the precision. The plate was on a clean section of the workbench, finished. Smaller than Brian had pictured, roughly circular, approximately the diameter of a coffee lid, perforated in a pattern that Tony explained was optimized for the specific frequency range in the specifications. The alloy had a slight blue-gray quality that spoke to its grade. Brian picked it up. It weighed almost nothing. "Your specs were exact," Tony said. His voice had the specific satisfaction of a craftsman whose work has been made easy by someone who knew what they needed. Whoever calculated these knew what they were asking for. I didn't have to interpret anything or make assumptions. That's rarer than it should be. Brian turned the plate over in his hands, looked at the perforation pattern. $140, 6 weeks. The particular arithmetic of expensive problems with simple solutions. "What's the application?" Tony asked, not prying the natural curiosity of someone who makes things and wants to understand where the things go. AI powertrain system. Frequency calibration issue. Tony nodded slowly. Measurement problem? Conversion error. Accumulated across multiple calibration points, common with international sourcing. Metric imperial handoffs. Tony wiped the plate with a clean cloth. Unnecessary. It was already clean, but habitual. Most engineers overcomplicate those problems. They look for the expensive fix, because the simple one doesn't seem proportionate to the scale of the failure. Brian looked at the plate. Thought about Marcus eating lunch alone in the corner of the cafeteria with a library card and a legal pad and 11 days of correct calculations that nobody had asked for. He thanked Tony. drove back toward Atlanta with the plate in a parts bag on the passenger seat. The highway moving at its mid-morning pace, the city filling the windshield in sections as the road curved north. He thought about what Tony had said, the simple fix not seeming proportionate. How the scale of a failure creates a kind of cognitive pressure towards solutions of equivalent scale. How 6 weeks of crisis trained the engineering team to look for a 6-week solution. How the size of the problem had functioned as a filter that excluded small answers. And Marcus, who had never been inside the pressure of the crisis in the same way, who had been on the outside of it reading documents off a conference table, had been free to follow the math wherever it actually went. He got back to the building at 11:15, put the parts bag in his desk drawer, and sat with the patience of a man waiting for a specific time, which is its own particular discipline. While Brian waited, Carol Nash on the 5th floor was doing something she had been doing in intermittent sessions since Wednesday. She had opened the personnel file system and was looking at a folder she had processed in approximately 4 minutes 3 years ago. The folder for Marcus Elliott. She had opened it 3 times already this week, each time getting partway through before something not reluctance exactly, more like the discomfort of a person who is about to find out something uncomfortable about themselves, had interrupted the reading. This time she read it completely. The resume, the degree from Georgia Perimeter, the AS Master Technician certification, which required demonstrated competence across 8 specialized areas, and was the highest credentialing level available in automotive service technology. The 3 years of industrial maintenance experience at a Hapeville manufacturing facility, involving diagnostic work on automated assembly systems. And the additional skills section, handwritten in the field that the application system left open for self-description, automotive engine diagnostics, harmonic analysis, AI mechanical systems integration, in his own handwriting. On an application submitted 3 years ago, AI mechanical systems integration. Written in the additional skills section of an application for a facilities maintenance role, by a man who was currently doing diagnostics work on an AI mechanical integration problem that 12 credentialed engineers had been unable to solve. Carol sat with that for a long time. Long enough to feel the specific quality of locating, precisely and without ambiguity, the exact point of your own failure. Not systemic failure, not policy failure, her specific failure. She had processed this application in 4 minutes. She had matched the applicant to the role, confirmed the role was filled, and moved on. That was the job. That was how the system worked. Nobody had asked her to read for more than a match. But nobody had asked Marcus Elliott what else he knew either. And the additional skills section was right there, in his handwriting, waiting. She opened a new email, typed Sandra Price's name in the recipient field, looked at the blinking cursor, started writing. Not a policy document, not an HR report. Just the truth in plain sentences. That 3 years ago a man had submitted an application to this company with credentials that should have generated a different conversation. That the conversation had not happened. That she was the person whose job it was to start those conversations, and she had not started it. 4 paragraphs. The original resume attached. Her name at the bottom. She looked at the send button for 45 seconds, did not press it, but did not close the window, minimized it and went back to the rest of her work, the email sitting open beneath everything else she did for the remainder of the morning, present and waiting. The conference room at 2 o'clock had the particular tension of a room where everyone understood the stakes, and nobody had agreed on what was about to happen. 12 engineers arranged around the table, with the specific arrangement of people who have spent 6 weeks together in a crisis and have developed the unspoken geography of their group where each person sits, who defers to whom, which silences mean disagreement and which mean exhaustion. Sandra at the head of the table. Dr. Angela Rivers in the corner with her leather notebook and reading glasses, which Marcus had not expected. He knew her name from the documents, knew her publication record, knew that she had been brought in as a consulting presence for the investor meeting, had not expected to find her already in the room at 2 o'clock on Thursday. Marcus came through the door with Brian. He was in his uniform, fresh, but the same navy polo, the same faded logo. He carried the folder that Brian had helped him organize that morning. His calculations printed cleanly from the photos Brian had taken of the legal pad, the conversion error demonstration, the vibration analysis data. He carried the legal pad itself, and in Brian's hands, the parts bag from Marietta, which Brian set on the table near his own seat without drawing attention to it. Sandra looked at Marcus the moment he came through the door. The look had stages. First, recognition without context, the way you recognize that a thing you expected to be in one place is in another. Then, recalibration, the specific adjustment of a person whose understanding of the room has just been altered. Then, the particular stillness of someone who is choosing how to respond rather than simply responding. Brian, her voice was even. Would you explain what's happening? Brian came away from the wall, stood at his seat. Marcus Elliott identified the engine fault and developed the repair approach. I asked him to present his own analysis to the group. Sandra stopped, restarted from a different position. His designated role at this company is facilities maintenance. His designated role, Brian said, with the specific deliberateness of someone who has chosen each word ahead of time, doesn't reflect his actual expertise. Today I'd like the expertise to speak. The room was quiet enough that the building's ventilation was audible. 12 engineers sat very still, caught in the specific paralysis of people watching a hierarchy negotiation that has not yet resolved and could go in either direction. Dr. Rivers had not looked up from her notebook, but her pen had stopped moving 2 sentences ago. Sandra looked at Marcus, and this time the look was different from the recognition adjustment sequence of 30 seconds before. This was the full attention of a person trying to read something she doesn't have prior data for, the uniform. The folder, the expression that was not apologetic and not aggressive, but simply present the expression of someone who has decided that the situation calls for being entirely himself and nothing else. 10 minutes, she said. Marcus sat down, opened the folder, looked at the 12 engineers who had been failing at this for 6 weeks, and at the consultant who had 41 years of the machine her, and at the CEO who had just given him 10 minutes. I won't need all of them, he said. He started with the oscilloscope data from the company's own records, not his measurements. The building's existing data. 67 tests of readings available on the shared monitoring interface that Marcus had accessed from the display panel in the hallway outside the engine room. Data that everyone in this room had looked at multiple times. He pointed to the 47th test output on the printout in front of him. This shadow pattern. In the baseline signal, right before each thermal compensation event, he drew a circle around it with his pen. It's present in all 67 tests. It falls below the standard deviation threshold that most diagnostic protocols flag. But it is completely consistent. He looked up. Consistent anomalies below the standard deviation threshold get categorized as ambient noise. I'd like to suggest this one wasn't noise. Dr. Rivers looked up from her notebook. Her pen was moving again. Marcus moved to the second page. The conversion calculation. He did not explain what a conversion was or why metric to imperial translation mattered. These were engineers, they knew. He simply showed the math, the SAE standard conversion factor, the factor in the calibration code, the delta, the cumulative drift across 47 calibration points, the resulting time calculation to thermal protection trigger. He showed it the way his grandfather had shown things without performance, without the urgency of a person who needs to sell their correctness. Just the information, presented clearly, in the confidence that correct information does not require salesmanship. One of the younger engineers leaned forward. Source for the SAE conversion spec? SAE J193971, Table 4, Unit Conversion Appendix. Cross-referenced in ISO 1000, the international standard for metric units. The engineer typed, read his screen, looked at Marcus, nodded once, the specific nod of verification. Sandra had not moved. She was doing what she did with things she was trying to understand, gathering information without committing to a response until the information was complete. Her face gave nothing, but she was entirely present, which in Sandra Price was its own form of signal. The fix, Marcus continued, is a vibration dampener plate. He set the spec sheet on the table. Custom machined to these tolerances. Installed at mounting bracket 3, between the sensor cluster and the crankshaft housing. It absorbs the frequency drift. The AI receives clean readings. The thermal protection stops triggering. The engine runs. He reached into the folder, set the plate on the polished wood of the conference table. It made a small, precise sound when it landed. 12 engineers and a CEO, and a 41-year veteran consultant looked at an object roughly the size of a coffee lid sitting in the center of a room where $85 million of consequences were currently in motion. Dr. Rivers stood, crossed to the table, picked up the plate with both hands, and turned it slowly, reading it with the hands of someone who has held thousands of components over 4 decades and knows exactly what she is feeling for. She was quiet for 30 seconds. The room extended the silence to her without discussion. "Where was this machined?" she asked Marietta. "This morning, alloy grade, 775 T6 aluminum. Aerospace equivalent." She set the plate down, looked at Marcus with an expression that had already completed its evaluation and was now simply recording the result. It was not the look of someone deciding whether he was credible. It was the look of someone who had decided and was filing the result in a place she would not misplace. "Install it," she said, "not a suggestion, not a recommendation. The particular declarative of someone whose professional authority is sufficiently established that her statements function as verdicts even when addressed to a room that technically answers to someone else." Sandra looked at Dr. Rivers, then at the plate, then at Marcus. "How confident are you?" she asked. And her voice had done something. The layer that was about demonstrating authority had dropped away, and what was underneath was the sound of a person who needs a real answer and knows the difference between that and a reassuring one. Marcus met her eyes. "Confident enough that I had the part machined before this meeting." Something moved across Sandra's face and was gone. The specific expression of a person receiving information that has implications they have not yet fully mapped. She looked at the plate, at the spec sheet, at the oscilloscope printout bearing her own company's data. She looked at Brian. Brian said nothing. He had said what he needed to say by walking Marcus through the door. "Install it," Sandra said. They did it in the engine room with Brian running the diagnostic equipment and Marcus handling the installation, and Dr. Rivers positioned on the left side with a notebook and reading glasses and the full attention of someone who has decided this is worth watching closely. 2 of the younger engineers took the monitoring stations. The others filtered in over the 45 minutes the process required. Marcus worked without narration, not performing confidence working. His hands moved with the specific economy of someone for whom the physical process of working with machinery is not a demonstration of capability, but simply the thing itself. The mounting bracket at position 3 required removing 4 bolts and a secondary housing cover to expose the interface cavity. The fit of the plate was exact, not approximate, not adjusted at installation, but precise. Because the specifications had been correct and Tony's machining had been correct, and no new errors had been introduced at any point in the chain from legal pad to finished component. It seated flush, clean. Marcus replaced the housing cover, replaced the bolts in the correct sequence, ran a manual verification of the sensor connections at 3 adjacent points. "Why those 3 specifically?" Dr. Rivers asked. She was not testing him. She was asking because she wanted to understand the methodology. These sensors respond first to frequency changes at the mounting interface. If the drift is absorbed, they normalize before the system-level data reflects it. They're the leading indicator. He stepped back from the engine, looked at it. "Ready?" Brian keyed the start sequence. The engine turned over, and the sound was different from the first revolution in a way that was not dramatic enough for someone without context, but was, for anyone who had heard 67 versions of the almost right sound, immediately and completely distinct. Smoother, more internally consistent. The specific quality of components finding the relationship they were built to have with each other. The diagnostic screens filled. Green across the monitoring stations, not the partial green that had appeared briefly in several previous tests before degrading, but sustained, stable, the kind of green that meant the numbers were reporting a real and ongoing condition rather than a momentary one. 14 minutes passed. 14 minutes and 23 seconds. The thermal protection did not trigger. Nobody in the room said anything. The engine ran 15 minutes, 18, 22, 27. The young engineer at the far monitoring station was typing with the specific rapid energy of someone documenting something they understand to be significant. At 31 minutes, Dr. Rivers closed her notebook. She looked across the room at Marcus, who was standing beside the engine with his hand flat against the housing, not checking anything mechanical, not taking readings, just present with it. The way someone stands beside a thing that has finally found its way. In 41 years, she said, quietly enough that the words belonged only to the immediate vicinity, I have seen perhaps a handful of diagnostic approaches that I would call genuinely elegant. What you did, the acoustic identification, the shadow pattern, the cumulative drift calculation that is not a workaround or a clever patch, a pause, and the pause had weight. That is engineering. Properly understood, Marcus looked at the engine. At the diagnostic screen still running green at 34 minutes. My grandfather said that a machine will always tell you what's wrong, he said. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. Dr. Rivers looked at him for a moment. Then she opened her notebook again and wrote something. He didn't ask what. Some things are better received without the asking. At 1:58 in the afternoon, Jerome King walked through the front doors of Velocity Drive Technologies. He came with Pamela Scott on his right and Dr. James Williams on his left, and he moved through the lobby with the unhurried authority of someone who has been making consequential decisions for 30 years and has long since stopped performing urgency. Kimberly met them and brought them to 14 with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been specifically briefed on every detail of the next 2 hours and understood that her job right now was to be invisible infrastructure. The engine was running when they entered the room. It had been running for 4 hours and 11 minutes. Jerome King was a person who read rooms. Had been doing it since before rooms like this one existed, since long before anyone in Atlanta's investment landscape had reason to know his name. He knew in the first 30 seconds of walking through the door that something had shifted. Not just the operational data, he'd received that update from Sandra 20 minutes ago. Something in the atmosphere. The particular quality of a room where something surprising has happened and the people in it are still in the process of understanding what it means about everything adjacent to it. He shook Sandra's hand. Brian's. Accepted Dr. Rivers's technical briefing, which she delivered with the economy of someone who respects the intelligence of the audience. Then he looked across the room at the man in the navy polo who was at the monitoring station reviewing the 4-hour data log with the focused attention of someone who needed to confirm that everything was still correct before he could stop confirming it. Who is that? Jerome said, quietly. To Sandra, Sandra's answer came a half-second later than it should have. Marcus Elliott. He identified and resolved the fault. How long with the company? 3 years. Jerome was quiet. He looked at Marcus for another moment, with the specific focus of someone whose professional life has required the rapid and accurate evaluation of people, and who has learned to trust that evaluation above most other information. Then he walked across the room, which was not on anyone's agenda, and stopped beside the monitoring station. Marcus looked up. Jerome King, his hand extended. Marcus shook it. Marcus Elliott, I understand you solved a problem that's been running for 6 weeks. I identified the source. The team implemented the fix. Tell me what the source was. And Marcus told him. The same way he had told the conference room without performance, without hedging, without the specific inflation that people sometimes bring to accounts of their own work when the audience is impressive. The conversion error, the cumulative drift, the 47 calibration points, the shadow pattern in 67 tests of oscilloscope data that had been sitting in the system logs categorized as ambient noise. Jerome listened. His face did not change during the explanation, but his eyes sharpened in the specific way of someone whose full intelligence has engaged and found purchase. What's your role here? Jerome asked. Marcus held his gaze. Facilities maintenance. Jerome King's expression did not change. What changed was something behind it. The specific internal revision of a person whose understanding of a situation has just been corrected faster than their face can respond to the correction. He turned Pamela. Pamela Scott crossed the room, stood beside Jerome. Her expression was the professional neutral of someone who has learned to receive information before responding to it. Read me the operational data. Last 4 hours, Pamela looked at the monitoring screen. Engine operational for 4 hours 17 minutes. Efficiency rating stable at 93.4%. Thermal readings nominal across all 22 sensors. 0 fault codes. 0 thermal protection triggers. 0 anomalous events of any category. Jerome looked at Marcus. This is your work. The installation was the team's. The diagnosis was mine. Don't make it smaller than it is, not unkind. Just accurate. in the flat way of someone who has spent decades watching people minimize their own contributions for reasons he has never found convincing. I've been in rooms where a solution was this close, thumb and forefinger, a centimeter, and no one could find it. Because finding it required a different kind of looking than the people in the room had been trained to do. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to find Sandra, and his voice shifted into the register of a man who was about to conduct business. Sandra, I'd like a few minutes. In private, the 12 minutes that followed happened in Sandra's office. Nobody on the 14th floor spoke for most of them. The engine ran. The screens stayed green. Dr. Williams reviewed data logs with the methodical thoroughness of a man who needed to be certain before reporting back to King Capital, and the certainty was accumulating line by line. Brian stood beside Marcus at the monitoring station. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Then Brian. Quiet enough that it didn't carry beyond the two of them. How are you doing? Marcus watched the data log accumulate, still running, still green. Ask me in 20 minutes. Fair enough. Stephanie was right, Marcus said. Brian looked at him. You could have presented the analysis as yours. I need you to know that I understand that, and I need you to know that it matters that you didn't. Brian was quiet for a moment, not deflecting, actually sitting with what Marcus had said. My grandfather had a hardware store in Savannah, he said finally. Opened it in 1962. You know what that took in Savannah in 1962? Not a question. He used to say the only thing that matters when you put your name on something is whether you can stand behind it in 20 years. He looked at the engine. I couldn't have stood behind it. Marcus said nothing. But the silence had the quality of full acknowledgement, not elaborate, not performed, just received completely. Which was the only kind of acknowledgement that meant anything between people who said what they meant. Sandra came back from her office at the 12-minute mark. Jerome King was behind her. His expression was the expression of a man whose decision has been made and whose remaining questions are logistical. She stood in the center of the room. The room oriented toward her the way rooms with Sandra Price in them always did not demanded, just the natural result of how she occupied space. Jerome has confirmed the investment continues, she said, steady. Whatever 12 minutes in her office had cost her was not visible on the surface. He has also raised a question about how we structure roles going forward to better utilize the expertise already present in this building. Jerome spoke from behind her. I'll be specific. Since Sandra is being thoughtful about framing, I'd like Marcus Elliott's title and compensation to reflect his actual contribution to this company. That's not a request. I want it in the supplementary agreement we signed today. The room absorbed this. 12 engineers absorbed it each in their own way, some with the uncomplicated relief of a just outcome, some with the more complex response of people who are glad about something that also makes them look honestly at things they haven't examined yet. Marcus absorbed it standing very still. He thought about a granola bar with oats, about numbers moving in the right direction, about his mother's voice at 8:47 in the morning. He thought about a legal pad on a desk in a parking garage, and 11 days of patience and the difference between knowing something and having the moment to say it. He thought about his grandfather's voice. Across all the years of distance between then and now, you keep doing what you're doing it for. You don't stop. I appreciate that, Marcus said. His voice was even, fully his, and I'd like to be useful going forward. That's what I came here to be. Jerome King looked at him for a moment, then nodded once, with the specific gravity of someone who has spent a long career distinguishing between the real thing and its imitations, and knows which one he is looking at. The engine ran. The screen stayed green. In the parking garage 5 floors below, Carol Nash sat in her car. The email was still open on her phone. The send button was still there. She had left the building early for the first time in months, because she needed space outside the building to do the thinking that could not happen inside it. She read the 4 paragraphs one more time. The resume attachment. The plain sentences about what had not happened 3 years ago, and why she was the person responsible for the not happening. She pressed send, sat with it. The specific quality of doing something you should have done 3 years earlier, knowing that the doing of it now does not undo the not doing of it then, but understanding that it is still the only right next move, not redemption. Just accountability, which is different and smaller and more honest. Her phone showed a new calendar notification. A meeting invitation for Friday morning. Subject: Personnel Structure Review. Attendees Sandra Price, Brian Okafor, HR. And at the bottom, added in the last 15 minutes. Marcus Elliott, Engineering Diagnostic Specialist. She looked at the new title in the attendee list for a long moment, accepted the invitation, put the car in drive, and went home through the Atlanta evening, the city doing its ordinary Thursday things around her, entirely unaware that something on the 14th floor of a glass tower on Peachtree Center Avenue had shifted into a different configuration than it had held for 3 years. The kind of shift that doesn't make news. That happens in the space between what a person is assigned to be and what they actually are, and in the decision made by one person, then another, to finally close that distance. The supplementary agreement took 90 minutes to draft, 23 minutes to negotiate, and 4 minutes to sign. Pamela Scott noted, to no one in particular, that this was standard King Capital timeline, a statement that functioned as both reassurance and mild correction. Her way of communicating that speed here was not carelessness, but clarity. Jerome King's attorney joined by phone from Charlotte, Velocity Drive's general counsel, Angela Young, who had been with the company since its second year and who had read every contract that had passed through this building and was not going to let a single clause pass without understanding its full implication, sat across the conference table and read every paragraph twice, not performing diligence. Actually doing it, Marcus was not in the room for the signing. He was at the monitoring station on the 14th floor, watching the data log accumulate minute by minute, because the engine had been running for 6 hours now, and he was not going to leave until certain was the right word. Not probably, not almost certainly, certain. 4 of the younger engineers had stayed with him, not because anyone assigned them to. Because something had happened in this building today that rearranged the furniture of how they understood their own floor, and they were not ready to go back to their desks and pretend the furniture was where it had been this morning. David, the 24-year-old from Howard's mechanical engineering program, who had spent 6 weeks feeling like he was failing a test no one had taught him to take, sat 2 stations down and looked at the oscilloscope output with the focused attention of someone learning to see something he had previously been looking at without seeing. After a long, quiet stretch, David turned toward Marcus, not all the way, just enough to make the question possible. "Can I ask you something?" "Yeah." "The shadow pattern. How did you know to look for it specifically? Not the main signal, not the primary frequency data, the shadow specifically." Marcus considered the question the way it deserved. Not quickly, not with the shorthand of someone who has explained something many times. "My grandfather taught me that what a machine is hiding is usually right next to what it's showing you. The main signal tells you what the system thinks is happening. The shadow tells you what's actually happening." A pause. He was talking about engines. But I think he was also just talking about most things. David wrote something in his notebook. Marcus noticed it was not the technical formulation he had just received. It was the other part. The part about what a machine hides and what it shows. The data log read 6 hours 47 minutes, green across every station. The engine, which had not run for more than 14 minutes and 23 seconds in 67 attempts, was still running. Marcus kept watching. He thought about Tony and Marietta, who had asked one question and machined a part in 2 hours and delivered it without needing to know what it meant. He thought about Dr. Patterson, who had sent a voice memo before 7 in the morning, because she knew the math was right and wanted Marcus to know she knew. He thought about Brian in the elevator this morning, choosing the more expensive direction at a fork in his own character and what that choice had made possible. He thought about his grandfather standing at the workbench on Linwood Avenue with an engine that 3 other mechanics had declared beyond repair, his hands moving with the patient certainty of someone who understood that machines don't fail without reason and reasons don't hide forever from people who know how to look. The data log reads 6 hours 52 minutes, still green. Marcus took his hand off the housing and stepped back, looked at the engine from a slight remove for the first time in hours. It was running the way it had been designed to run, quietly, efficiently, without struggle. He picked up his folder, said good night to David and the others, and took the elevator down to the parking garage. He sat in the Civic for a few minutes before starting the engine, not doing anything. just sitting with the particular quality of a day that had changed the shape of things and needed a moment to be acknowledged before it became the past and the next thing started. His phone showed a text from a number he didn't have saved. He read it once and then read it again. "This is Angela Young from Velocity Drive Legal. Brian Okafor gave me your number. The supplementary agreement was signed at 5:47 this evening. Your personnel reclassification is effective tomorrow morning. I'll have the formal documentation to you by 8. Congratulations, Mr. Elliott." He looked at the text for a moment, then put the phone face down on the passenger seat. He started the car. But before he pulled out, he picked the phone back up and called his mother. Denise Elliott picked up on the second ring. Her voice had the barometric reading he had learned to pass before she said a single content word, tonight. It was warm and awake, which meant she had rested, and the afternoon had been manageable, and she was in the kitchen, probably, with the television on at low volume the way she kept it when she was not specifically watching, but wanted the sound of other voices in the house. "You eat dinner?" "I'm about to, Marcus. Real food. I promise." "Mama, I need to tell you something," he told her. Not the technical parts, she didn't need those, and they were not the point. The point was that today, in a building where he had been invisible for 3 years and 2 months, he had done the thing he had come there to do. Had done it in front of people who had the authority and the expertise to evaluate it, and they had seen it, not partially, not with reservation. They had seen it completely, and the seeing had consequences that were now in a signed document. Denise Elliott was quiet after he finished. Not the short quiet of someone composing a response, the longer quiet of someone receiving something they have been waiting for long enough that the receiving itself requires time. "Your grandfather said this would happen," she said finally. "Mama, he did. Don't make that sound. He sat at my kitchen table. You were 16, maybe 17, and he said, 'Denise, that boy is going to walk into a room someday and fix something nobody else in the room could fix, and the room is going to have to reckon with itself.' He said it just like that." Reckoning. Her voice had something in it now that Marcus had not heard since before the diagnosis, not happiness, which was too simple a word for what existed in the middle of a treatment course, but the particular quality of a person who has been carrying a piece of someone else's future for years and is finally, carefully, placing it where it belongs. "I have been waiting a long time to make this phone call." Marcus sat in the parking garage, the Civic idling. The concrete and the fluorescent lights and the ordinary sounds of a building's mechanical infrastructure running its evening routines around him. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Because that was always the question that mattered most, regardless of what else had happened. "Good. Better than yesterday." A pause. "Dr. Patterson called this afternoon. The blood work from Tuesday. He made himself breathe normally. She said the markers are down, significantly down. She used the word encouraging, which you know is physician language. For I am actually quite hopeful, but I have learned not to say that until I am more certain." A pause. "Marcus," she said, encouraging. He sat with that. Encouraging. Numbers moving in the right direction. 2 pieces of news arriving in the same evening from different directions, both of them using the language of progress, of things heading toward something better rather than away from it. "That's good, Mama," he said. His voice was even. It took some work to make it even. "It's good." She was quiet for a moment. "Baby, your grandfather would have been so proud of you today. I want you to know that, not just about the engineering, about how you did it. Patient, honest, without bitterness." Her voice was certain in the way that mothers are certain about the things they have watched for years. "That's the hardest part. That's the part most people can't do." Marcus looked at the concrete pillar in front of the car, at the stenciled number that marked the parking space, at his own hands on the steering wheel. "Go eat something real," his mother said. "And call me tomorrow." "I will. I love you. Love you." "Mama." He drove to a Jamaican place on Campbellton Road that he had been going to for 2 years because the food was good and the portions were honest. And the woman who ran the front counter had never once looked at his uniform and adjusted how she spoke to him. He ordered jerk chicken and rice and sat in a corner booth and ate it slowly. He was not in a hurry. The evening was his. The next morning would bring documentation and a new badge and a meeting that would formalize what had already happened, but none of that was tonight. Tonight was the chicken and the rice and the sound of the restaurant doing its ordinary Thursday business around him. A couple in the booth across the way, arguing pleasantly about something on a phone screen. Two older men at the counter with coffee. The woman at the register chatting with a regular. He sat in it, let it be ordinary, because ordinary after a day like this one was its own particular gift. He thought about the Elliott protocol the name Brian's team had attached to the methodology before Marcus had agreed to it, which he had discovered was the way things get named in buildings full of engineers. Not by committee, but by the thing simply becoming its name through use. He would need to write it properly, not the legal pad version. A real document with formal structure that could be read by someone who had never watched him work and could still understand what the methodology was and why it worked and how to apply it. He thought about David writing in his notebook, about what it might mean for the approach to exist somewhere outside of Marcus's head and hands, accessible, teachable, no longer dependent on whether you happen to know the right person at the right time. He finished eating, left a cash tip that was more than the minimum because the woman at the counter always remembered his order from the previous visit, and that kind of memory deserved acknowledgement. Drove home through Atlanta at 9 in the evening, the city at its comfortable pace, and sat at his desk and opened a fresh legal pad. At the top of the first page he wrote, Elliott Protocol Acoustic Mechanical Diagnostic Methodology for AI Integrated Powertrain Systems version 1. He looked at that for a moment, then wrote in smaller letters underneath, for Thomas, and started writing. The personnel review on Friday morning was not the hard conversation. This surprised several people who had expected it to be difficult in proportion to how unusual it was. Angela Young ran it with the precise efficiency of someone who had been handling complex personnel transitions for 17 years and had no interest in allowing discomfort to become drama. Carol Nash had prepared documentation that was thorough and honest in the specific way of someone who had done their due diligence late and was not pretending otherwise. The original application, the additional skills section, a formal acknowledgement of the gap between what the hiring process had captured and what it should have captured, and a proposed revision to the skills evaluation component of all future technical role applications. Marcus signed 4 documents, initialed 3 more. Received his new badge from Kimberly, who had made him a cup of coffee without being asked and set it on the table near his chair without comment, which was either a gesture of welcome or simply the response of a decent person to a situation that called for it. Probably both. Brian shook his hand at the end of the meeting, not the firm professional handshake of colleagues, the two-handed kind, with eye contact that held for a moment longer than necessary and communicated something that neither of them was going to articulate because it did not require articulation. The protocol documentation, Brian said, whenever you have it. No deadline. I started it Thursday night. Brian looked at him. Of course you did. The new desk was on the engineering side of the 14th floor. Not a corner, a window-adjacent position in the main engineering area, the kind of placement that signals inclusion rather than accommodation. Someone had already put a nameplate on it. Marcus Elliott, Engineering Diagnostics Specialist. The nameplate was slightly crooked. He straightened it, set the photograph of Thomas Elliott on the left side of the desk. Set the mechanical puzzle, a complex interlocking ring system he had owned for 4 years and worked through his hands constantly while thinking on the right. He opened his laptop and began the work that was now officially, formally, documentably his work to do. David appeared at the edge of the desk area at 10:30. Still in his own engineering section, but close enough to have crossed a small invisible line to get there. He had his notebook, question about the shadow pattern threshold parameters, he said. If the calibration deviation is below 0.02 delta rather than 0.003, does the methodology still apply or does it require modification? Marcus looked up. Pull up last week's oscilloscope output from the secondary system check. David had it on his laptop. He brought it over and set it on the desk. They looked at it together. At 0.002 delta, you won't see the shadow in the main signal layer, Marcus said. He pointed to a section of the waveform. You'll see it here, in the response lag on the compensation event. Smaller, harder to find, but structurally identical. He traced the pattern with his pen, not touching the screen. The methodology applies. The detection threshold just needs adjusting. David leaned in, looked at the waveform for a long moment, found it. There. David straightened, wrote something. That should be in the formal documentation. Version 1, Section 3. I'll have a draft to Brian by end of next week. David nodded, went back to his desk. Marcus watched him go and thought about what it meant that the methodology was already being used, already being tested against new problems, already generating questions that refined it. Thought about what his grandfather would have said about that. Thomas Elliott had taught Marcus everything he knew about engines, but he had never written any of it down. The knowledge had traveled through the hands, through demonstration, through the specific transmission of a person working beside another person, and allowing them to see not just the result, but the process. Now it was going to be written down, under his name, in a format that anyone with the right foundation could pick up and use. That felt like something. He was not sure what to call it yet. But it felt like something that mattered in a direction beyond himself, which was the direction his grandfather had always said the best work traveled. 3 weeks after the engine ran, Dr. Angela Rivers sent an email. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when Marcus was deep in the third revision of the protocol document, and he read it once and then set it aside and then picked it up and read it again because the first reading had not quite resolved. Marcus, I am writing a paper for the SAE Journal on emerging diagnostic methodology in AI-integrated powertrains. I would like to reference the approach you developed and demonstrated at Velocity I Drive. Specifically the acoustic mechanical analysis sequence, the shadow pattern detection in oscilloscope baseline data, and the cumulative drift calculation methodology. This is original work. It should be in the literature. I can submit under joint authorship, which would give it immediate visibility through my existing relationship with the journal's editorial board, or under your name alone, which would establish the attribution correctly from the beginning. Your call entirely. But submit you should and soon. The field needs this. Marcus read it a third time, then set it on the desk beside the photograph of his grandfather, joint authorship with Dr. Angela Rivers. Her name carried 4 decades of published work and more than 300 citations in automotive engineering literature. Her co-authorship would guarantee that the paper reached practitioners who might otherwise scroll past an unknown name in the table of contents. It was a generous offer. It was also a version of what had already happened to Marcus for 3 years being useful to something, while someone else's name provided the access. He sat with that for a while, turned the mechanical puzzle over in his hands, the interlocking rings moving through their configurations by touch while his mind worked the other problem. He thought about David, who had found the shadow pattern in a secondary system and come to about threshold parameters. He thought about the 3 external companies that Brian had mentioned were already requesting copies of the internal protocol document through industry contacts. He thought about what it meant for the methodology to be attributed correctly from the beginning, not as a matter of ego, which was not what this was, but as a matter of the record being accurate. The record that future engineers would consult, the record that would determine, for the people who came after him, whether this kind of knowledge had a named origin or simply appeared attributionless in the literature. He typed back, "My name alone, but I want you to know what the offer meant. Not everyone would have offered. Thank you for that and for watching as carefully as you did in that engine room." Dr. Rivers replied in 7 minutes. "Correct decision. I'll write you a reference for the peer review committee. Submit by the 15th. The field has been doing this work without this framework for too long." He submitted on the 12th. 3 days later, a response from the editorial coordinator confirmed receipt and assigned a peer review track. Marcus forwarded the confirmation to Brian without comment. Brian replied with a single line, framing this for the lobby. Marcus typed back, "Let's wait until it's accepted, Brian. It'll be accepted." Marcus looked at the exchange for a moment, set the phone down. Went back to version 3 of the protocol document, which was better than version 2 in 11 specific ways that David's questions had made possible, and which was going to be better than version 3 by the time it was done. Outside the window, Atlanta was doing its ordinary late October things, the air finally carrying the clarity that came when the humidity released its summer grip, the trees along Peachtree beginning the slow shift that they always began reluctantly and finished beautifully. Marcus worked through the afternoon with the particular focus of someone who has found the work that is actually theirs to do, which is a different quality of focus from competence applied to someone else's definition of useful. His phone buzzed. Stephanie Okafor, Saturday dinner. Our place. 7, not optional. He typed back. I'll check my schedule. Her response. You have a legal pad and a mechanical puzzle. Saturday 7. He put the phone away, kept working. The last conversation happened in an elevator. Not a metaphor constructed after the fact, an actual elevator, on a Wednesday morning in late October, when Atlanta had committed to autumn. And the air through the parking garage had a sharpness to it that made the transition from outside to inside feel like a distinct event. Marcus stepped in at the lobby level at 8:51 with his coffee and his laptop bag. Sandra stepped in at the same floor 30 seconds later, coming from the direction of the parking structure with her phone already in her hand, and the particular forward momentum of someone whose day starts before they arrive. The doors closed. They were the only 2 people in it. 21 floors. Approximately 45 seconds. For the first 15 of those seconds, neither of them said anything. Not awkward silence, the silence of 2 people who have recently had a significant and honest conversation and are not going to fill the space between them with noise just because it exists. Sandra looked at the floor numbers changing. Marcus looked at the floor numbers changing. How's the say submission? She asked. Under review. 8 to 12 weeks, the editorial coordinator said. Let me know when it publishes. A pause. Then, I'd like to have it framed for the lobby. She said it without looking away from the numbers. Something people walk past every day, until they stop and actually read it. Another pause that had something in it, not quite irony, not quite self-reproach, but occupying the territory between them. We're going to be a building that stops walking past things. That's the intention I'm working toward. The elevator opened at 14. Sandra stepped out, stopped, turned back. How's your mother? The question was direct and specific, not the general courtesy question. The question of someone who had looked at a personnel file and understood what had been funding 3 years of late-night reading and legal pad calculations in parking garages. Partial remission, Marcus said. Treatment continuing. Dr. Patterson used the word encouraging. Sandra held his gaze for a moment. Just a moment. Good, she said. The one-word version of meaning it entirely. She walked toward her office. Marcus walked toward his desk, toward the photograph of Thomas Elliott and the mechanical puzzle, and the laptop with version 3 of the protocol document open in the middle of a section on threshold parameters. Toward the window that looked out over Atlanta doing its Wednesday morning work. Toward the nameplate that said Engineering Diagnostics Specialist and was no longer crooked. He sat down, set his coffee to the right of the laptop, pulled the mechanical puzzle toward him with his left hand, which was where it lived while he was thinking, and opened the protocol document. David's question from the previous week had opened a refinement in the threshold section that Marcus had been working toward for 2 days. The revision was almost right. Not quite. There was a precision issue in how the document described the detection sequence for deviations below 0.002 delta. The language was technically correct, but not clear enough to be useful to someone who had not already watched the methodology applied. He needed to find the sentence that made the process visible. He worked through the morning with the specific focus of someone doing the work that is actually theirs, not the work assigned to them, not the work they have negotiated space to do. The work that belongs to them in the way that only a few things in a life genuinely belong, because it came from somewhere specific and real in them, was shaped by hands and voices and years of attention that no credential can produce and no job title can confer. At 11:15 he found the sentence, wrote it, read it back. It was right. He moved on to the next section. At some point in the early afternoon, without having decided to, he reached a natural stopping place and sat back and looked at the document as a whole, its structure, its completeness, what it had become across 3 versions, and David's contributions and the 2 weeks of concentrated work that had followed a legal pad and a parking garage, and 11 days of knowing something that no one had asked him yet. He thought about his grandfather in the garage on Linwood Avenue, working on engines that other mechanics had given up on, building a body of knowledge that traveled through demonstration rather than documentation, because that was the only transmission method available to him. Teaching Marcus, not because Marcus was going to be engineer in any official sense. Thomas Elliott had not known that, could not have known that, but because the knowledge deserved to continue. Because some things are too important to let end with the person who carries them. The document existed now. It had his name on it. It was going to be in the SAE journal under that name, where engineers who had never been to Atlanta, and never heard of velocity drive technologies, and never stood in a parking garage running the same calculation for the fourth time to make sure it was still right, would be able to find the methodology and use it. That was not a small thing. He let himself feel the full size of it for a moment. Then he saved the document, closed the laptop, and stood up from the desk. The photograph of Thomas Elliott caught the afternoon light coming through the window at the particular angle that the late October sun achieved. At this hour, low, warm, the kind of light that makes the shadows on familiar objects fall differently than usual, so that you see them slightly fresh, slightly new. The way things look when they have been in one place long enough to become invisible, and then something shifts and you see them again. Marcus looked at the photograph, his grandfather's hand on the hood of the Cadillac DeVille, the work light overhead, the expression that was not quite a smile and not quite concentration but some compound of both that Marcus had spent years trying to find a name for, and had eventually decided did not have one. It was just Thomas. In the place where Thomas was most himself, doing the work that was most his, he picked up his bag, said goodnight to David, who was still at his desk with his notebook open to a page dense with the specific shorthand of someone who is working out something they find genuinely interesting. Took the elevator down through the building's afternoon rhythms, walked through the lobby past the wall where Sandra intended to frame something when the time came. He went home, made dinner, real dinner, with vegetables, because his mother would ask, called her and told her about the protocol document and the SAE submission timeline, and the dinner he had made, in that order which was the order she preferred. She laughed at something he said about the vegetables, and the laugh was full and easy and the best sound in his day. He sat at his desk afterward, looked at the legal pad, at the first page, with the version 1 header and the dedication beneath it. He thought about what it meant to carry knowledge that no one had asked for years, in a building that had categorized you at the door and forgotten to look again. Thought about the cost of that, not in bitterness, because bitterness was not a productive instrument, but honestly, clearly, the way you look at a problem when you are trying to understand its true dimensions, rather than the version that is easier to hold. And then he thought about what had happened when the moment came. Brian sitting down across from him in the cafeteria, the engine room at 9:15, the conference room at 2 o'clock. Jerome King walking across the room, because he was a person who read rooms and understood that the interesting thing in this one was not where it was supposed to be. The moment when it came had come because the work was real and the math was right, and because several people had made a decision, in sequence, to let the truth be more important than the comfortable version of things. Brian at the fork in his character, Dr. Rivers saying, "Install it," Carol Nash pressing send on an email she had been composing and deleting for 3 days. That was how it worked. Not a single moment of recognition arriving from outside like a verdict. A series of small decisions made by people who chose, each in their own moment and for their own reasons, to close the distance between what they knew and what they did about it. He opened the legal pad to a blank page. At the top, in his usual handwriting, he wrote a question not for the protocol document, not for the SAE submission, but for himself, the way he sometimes wrote things that needed to be examined rather than answered. What does a person owe the knowledge they carry? He looked at it, thought about his grandfather, who had given the knowledge to Marcus rather than let it end with him. Thought about Dr. Patterson, who had given him library access and told him not to return the card. Thought about Tony and Marietta, who had machined a part with no waste and asked one good question and needed nothing explained twice. He thought about David, writing in his notebook the part that was not technical. The knowledge didn't want to stay in one place. That was the thing about it. It wanted to move, to be tested against new problems and refined by new questions and passed on to people who would refine it further and pass it on again. That was what knowledge did. When it was healthy, it traveled. And the person who carried it well was not the one who held it most tightly, but the one who understood when and how and to whom to release it. He had spent 3 years carrying it in a building that had not known to ask for it. That was the building's failure, And it was also the particular condition that had allowed the knowledge to develop undisturbed to become as precise as it was, as tested, as certain, because no one had been in a hurry to use it before it was ready. He was not going to stop carrying it, but he was going to start, deliberately and formally and with his name attached, releasing it into the larger current where it could do what knowledge does when it moves. He set the pen down, looked at the question on the page, did not write an answer, did not need to. The answer was the document on his laptop, and the submission at the SAA journal, and the revised protocol, waiting for version 4 and David's notebook, and the framed thing that would eventually go in the lobby of a building that was working, imperfectly and honestly, toward becoming different from what it had been. The answer was the work. It had always been the work. He closed the legal pad, set it beside the photograph of Thomas Elliott, the two things that had been present for all of it, from the beginning, the photograph and the pad, turned off the desk lamp, and went to sleep in the ordinary Atlanta dark, with the window unit doing its uneven hum, and the city doing its ordinary Wednesday things outside, and the specific piece of a person who has done the work that is actually theirs to do and is ready, tomorrow, to do more of it. How many people are in a building near you right now carrying knowledge that no one has thought to ask for, because someone looked at the category and stopped there? It's not a comfortable question. The gap between what we assume people know and what they actually know is almost never malice. It's habit. It's the particular efficiency of a system that matches categories to categories and calls that thoroughness. And it costs something every time, not just to the person who isn't asked, but to everyone in the building who needed what that person knew and is now solving the problem without it. Marcus Elliott spent 3 years invisible in a building where the answer to the most important problem was sitting in his head and his hands and a legal pad in a maintenance cart. That's not a story about waiting to be discovered. It's a story about what it costs to not ask, and about what becomes possible when someone finally does. Have you ever been the person in the room who knew and waited for the moment to say it? Or have you been the one who almost walked past the answer because of the category you had assigned to the person carrying it? We read every comment, and some of the most important conversations we have ever had started in a comment section, just like this one.